Linda.
Hey, Louis.
How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks so much for agreeing to join me in this Louis and Friends live conversation. I kind of want to call it Louis's favorite people conversation because I've really been starting with so many people that have been just real friends and influencers in the work we're doing in the apparel sector. So you are at the
Well, I'm
top of
glad
the
to be
list.
part of that select
You
group.
are. You
Thank
are
you.
for sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, well, we're going to talk about, I think, a lot of things today. But to the audience that's listening, just to kind of introduce Linda, Greer is well, I'm just going to say, because you got the Badass Award a number of years ago, that's how I refer to you as well.
One of my favorites.
Within the and that was a non-official title of an award that we said this is the Badass Award for people who are really changing the industry. And I sort of feel, Linda, like you're one of those people that that everyone who's actually doing the work knows who you are, and you're sort of like the hero behind the scenes, which we'll dive into. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast and don't know Linda Greer, she is a well, I'm going to read right here from this, is a specialist in industrial chemical pollution. And she is formerly from the NRDC and the founder of the Clean by Design program, which AII is working to scale. So we'll talk about that. And you're currently working as a fellow with the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, IPE, which is a leading environmental NGO in China. So we definitely want to hear about that as well. So Linda, when I think about you, I really think about sort of the nuts and bolts of how apparel is being made, and really diving into what we're trying to solve for when it comes to some of the core issues in the apparel industry. And your background is as a toxicologist. So how does a toxicologist become one of the most important truth tellers in the fashion industry? How did that happen?
So, how I even became a toxicologist was through my great love of being outdoors and being in the environment, and eventually narrowed things down to really being worried about the impact that pollution was having, both on the environment and public health. So very applied focus, which, by the way, is a little bit unusual for scientists in general. And then, how I wound up with the fashion industry was I sort of followed the pounds, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I had been for many years in my career working for NRDC on industrial pollution problems. And many of those industrial pollution problems went overseas because industry globalized and moved out of our country. And this sort of forced me to become more globally focused, and of course set my eyes immediately on China, which is still today the workshop of the world. And luckily for me, NRDC had an office there. So our only international office there at the time. And so when I got to China, I was looking for an industry that could be my first point of focus. That was a serious polluter, and naively thought I would do one and then move on to the next and the next and the next. So I was looking for an industry that really mattered, that had a consumer focus so that people would really care about it, and where I could apply the skill set that I had both academically as a toxicologist, and then, my practical skills from years of advocacy to try to shift that industry into sort of better compliance and better performance as a model for other industries in China and then the rest of the world. So, a modest agenda for one person, but
right.
Yeah.
And so when you started, and this is the seed of what became the program called Clean by Design, and the one that AII is working on, which we'll talk more about what that's all about. But when you started it, was the first thing to do to dive in and go to facilities and actually understand the core issues and where these opportunities for improvements would exist? Or how did you didn't start with corporate, because you really started with sort of at the source of where the sausage is being made, right?
Exactly. And, I used to joke that as an advocate, I could only use my Ph.D. in toxicology a few times a year. And my master's degree is actually in environmental science and engineering. So I also have the ability to go into factories, not as a global expert, but as a knowledgeable person, and look at both the sort of engineering side of things and the health effects side of things. So my background, as you could see, was well suited to this type of work. what I really wanted to do was start from the bottom up and start looking at what really are the sources of pollution, what is the state of performance of this industry, and then what could the solutions really be, rather than kind of coming in with a preconceived notion. For example, the United States has a number of laws and regulations about pollution. They have focused on this industry in the past, and I'm going to come in and sort of try to apply what has worked elsewhere as a policy matter. So yeah, so it was bringing in a small selected set of international experts to do tours of typical factories. I will say that the way we got into those factories was by a few companies opening those doors for us. So kudos to those companies, and we can circle around to that in a minute. And then what we did was a laborious process of looking very carefully at about 5 factories for where their sources of pollution lay in the factory. And then which ones of those would have readily addressable solutions. And then looking across all of them for which ones were in common, which showed up over and over again. And we were looking for low-hanging fruit opportunities that Clean by Design became known for, that could be easily implemented and actually save money rather than cost money in the short run for these factories, rather than being very ambitious.
So you went in with the goal of having a return on investment be part of it. That wasn't a byproduct of going in and for the improvements having to be the driver.
Right. So I had some experience on this. I'll tell you just a short thumbnail on that. But my experience from a project that I had done in the United States sort of had convinced me that when you looked at the problems that China had with so many factories, literally hundreds of thousands of factories, and the problem that the government would have in pulling all those factories into global standards of performance, it seemed obvious to me that a better driver than just government regulation would be cost savings. That if we could make a true and valid business case, that this actually made sense financially, that would be a huge leg up on otherwise sort of circling around and trying to bring regulations up to speed. So I was really interested in whether we could find those sorts of opportunities, and I was specifically investigating that when we sent in our investigators, rather than looking for, let's say, the problems in pollution control devices or the gaps between what was being required and what was going on.
Right. So one of my questions was going to be, today it's still challenging to recruit a facility to do this work, and we have the proof. You can go in and show it. And I was going to say it was probably really hard at the beginning to say we're going to come in and look at your bad behavior, but you were coming in with saying we're going to come in and look at ways to save you money and improve. So it was did you say that up front so that the invitation was potential savings?
This is as you've heard me say about Clean by Design, it's that program is half engineering and half psychology. Yeah. So we knew right off the bat from previous experience I'd had here in the United States with a big project with Dow Chemical, that if you go into a factory and say, we're looking for the problems that you've overlooked, that if you had fixed them would save you money, that is not exactly a welcoming message to go in with, because it sort of sounds like the game, who's the dunce? Who overlooked these opportunities that you should have captured if you knew what you were doing? So the truth of the matter is that we understood that the way that factories had prioritized what they cared about was with an eye on money, but that some of the largest ways for them to save money were not necessarily also environmental improvements. What we were looking for is that sweet spot that they would save money and they would improve their environmental performance. And we carefully selected our assessors and our messages to make it clear that we really had a lot to learn before we could divine opportunities that they could show us that were that sweet spot. So I'm not just being rhetorical here. That's actually the real deal. If you said to a factory, tell me the very best ways for you to get the highest return on investment of your capital, this stuff would not be it. That's not the right question that gives you clean by design. But if you said to them, you have a problem with your environmental performance, and on the menu of options are things that are going to cost you a lot of money and things that are going to save you money, they'll go for the ones that will save them the money. And so we
Absolutely.
just needed to kind of create that a narrative frame for ourselves and for the factories to open the curtain for the investigation and to sort of settle in on the best practices that are part of Clean by Design.
That's amazing. I love hearing this because it's really about change management. It's really about how you change systems and how it really is the psychology of how we deliver this. And we've always known that if sustainability ever felt punitive to anyone, including the consumer, it's just not going to fly. Nobody wants to be told, you have to take less of a shower. You need to buy, buy less things. Well, that's debatable, but people don't want to feel like they're being punished by adopting these. They want to feel like they're shifting the way they approach values or the way they're looking at, sort of greater value they can create. Right. And that's
right. And,
about.
these sort of principles of very active listening are really very important because the fact of the matter was, and still is, that we had a lot to learn. There were certain opportunities that were completely unpalatable to factories, and we needed to take that into account. One of the things we learned very early was there were a lot of opportunities to improve the recipes that factories were using for their dyeing. But that was sort of the third rail for a lot of these factories, because you know what? That was like you're messing with success sort of strategy. Like, we have important criteria that we need to meet for our orders. We know what works. And unless the buyer is willing to take the risk for not meeting those standards, we don't want to mess with this. That meant that we had to set aside some very valuable possibilities that we would have loved to do. But we very much took that to heart, that those were sort of high risk, high gain improvement strategies. And that for very understandable reasons, I mean, the buyers would certainly say, no, if you don't meet the standards, the criteria for the order, then it's on you, not us. For very understandable reasons, that was not going to be green lighted. So that's why I'm not saying it was just rhetorical. We really honestly had a lot to learn to make sure that the solutions that we were developing were ones that were desirable, beyond palatable, actually desirable for the factories here.
Yeah. I think you said something really, I think, important for people to kind of lock in, is that the way that the industry, this is true in all industries or all systems, is we're incentivized to do the same old thing, right? It's the cheaper, fast, already broken through whatever research and development and upstart cost to adopt something. 200 years ago, we figured out these formulations and how to fix the dyes, and so it's all down to turnkey production, where a brand retailer needs to know that the quality of this is going to be consistent, right, all across all of it. And so we've gotten to this place where if you tamper with that as a manufacturer in any way, you could lose the contract. And it's such a fickle supply chain in terms of the price being along lower price points or regions, that this de-incentivizes innovation unless all parties are willing to say, we're raising our hands and we're up for it, because we know that this is this is a moment to step into some research and development around, is this going to work? Kind of, do you have sort of thoughts on, I mean, am I articulating it accurately, or how do you sort of feel
and
that process?
You're putting meat on the bones of the way that I like to define equal partnership. There's a lot of rhetoric about equal partnership, and it makes me a little crazy because I'm not sure exactly what it means. But what you just articulated is actually what it means, because that would be a sort of a shared risk equation. And by the way, nobody is suggesting that factories go and do something that's not well proven and is wild and crazy. I mean, unless somebody wants to try that, and that would be a beautiful thing, but that would be under those circumstances. But yeah, I mean, I think, we have now a number of very prominent brands who have made extremely bold commitments with regards to their science-based targets. Many of them signing up for, zero discharge for, chemical and wastewater improvements, water utilization, biodiversity protection. I mean, these are bold commitments. But you know what? Talk is cheap. And in order to fulfill those commitments, those brands have to get in the sandbox and look for these improvements and be willing to shoulder some of the cost and some of the risk burden in order to make progress. And then that's, I think, that's the equation that we need in order to really come out on the other side of this thing with an improved environmental footprint for the industry, all parties.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that, where that, you said something about, we're not asking them to do crazy things, but we might. And that needs to be put into a design thinking early stage. This is risky. This is experimental. And then look at how other industries like perhaps Silicon Valley approaches these things. It's like a fail, fast approach. We go in knowing that this may not work. And so then how are we incentivizing a facility to say, you're protected, we're bringing catalytic money to pay for the time that you've had to pull the machines down to try this new thing or this new material, right? So we all agree that we're in an experimentation phase. And I think that's something that's going to happen with, we know what to do, and it's about improving the current system or removing coal burning or something. But there's going to be certain things that we're going to have to do that are somewhat risky. And brand retailers aren't in the business to be, the innovators of all this risk, right? And so, are we bringing in the right players then to sort of protect the facility to go into that space? I guess is how I think
and this
about
is
it.
exactly the right question. And it also, for me, immediately evokes, this is an area where we really need collective action. So to ask a single brand to do this, that's a stretch. To ask a group of brands to enter into and design sort of an experiment, so to speak, where there are key questions or a key interest in a certain innovation.
Experimentation, and we're gonna test out unproven things, which at the beginning of Clean by Design, you were allowed to go into this sort of, we're fact finding, we're developing, and there's going to be a lot of this where we're bringing in and piloting new ideas and solutions. And I was saying, I think that we have to call it that. But brands and retailers, and this isn't any shame or blame on their part, they're not in the business of revolutionizing energy or revolutionizing, machines and equipment. So being able to kind of bring the right partners in place, but inviting everybody to say, this is a fail, fast space, and we're going to think this so we iterate it until it works, or move it out and say this absolutely won't work, and then we can move on. I mean, that's critical towards getting to the next phase. And this idea that we have to create this environment of supporting that. And that might mean bringing catalytic funding to a manufacturer to cover their costs, to protect the relationship and say, we will not move you out as a preferred vendor if you do this work and it fails, et cetera.
Right. I mean, two things jump to mind. The first is that this is an extremely kind of rich area for collective action. That rather than asking one company to go ahead and do this, and one factory even to go ahead and do this, the idea that, let's say, there are half a dozen really promising but very innovative and risky improvements that people are eyeing for the industry, to get a group together, get joint funding to do it, and then design it, lay it out, review the results, and sort of reach a collective determination, I think is really a very important opportunity for the industry to begin to develop. The other thing that jumps into my mind, and maybe this is because in the United States, we now have a new president, and we also have a very revitalized sense of expectation for the upcoming COP negotiations on carbon and greenhouse gases, is the possible role of the government to do some of this. We have not really seriously looked at government R&D money and government R&D efforts, be them Chinese government or United States government or World Bank or others, to really fund and assess some very important innovations in this sector, as well as other industry sectors. And it may really be time for us to look more sort of proactively and constructively at where we could get a lot of synergy and benefit from government work and government research dollars in order to be able to crack some of the conundrums that we have in this industry. And the one there that jumps to mind, just to go on and on for a minute, is, we've really got to do something about industrial boilers that are in China and many other places, largely fueled by coal. We do not have commercially available solar or renewable energy boilers, and getting a renewable source of industrial steam as opposed to just renewable electricity is just like, a tiger of a different stripe. And that's a stretch. So there's an area so critical to reducing the footprint of this industry, and yet one that I think, maybe beyond just private sector reach, where we ought to be looking bigger and thinking bigger for necessary innovations.
Yeah, and for listeners who aren't in this industry, it's important to kind of highlight this. But you know what? There's also some brand folks who may not really fully get that the wet processing of our clothes, tier 2, we call it tier 2, where we are burning coal predominantly or other things with high carbon emissions in order to fix the dyes in our clothing, is the highest carbon emitting source of the whole industry, right? Isn't that accurate?
Right? Yeah, that's totally accurate.
Yeah, and it's actually the first thing and the most important thing you could do. So when we talk about in sustainability work, like really finding the right levers to pull, like if we just made everyone focus on that, including, as you said, like research and funders, almost an X prize for developing a new process for renewable energy source to that process, that would be a major heavy the industry reaching the 2030 goals for climate.
Yeah. I mean, what this industry needs to do, like all industries, and is not doing, may I say that again, is not doing, is to follow the pounds. If I read one more report about somebody's, putting in more efficient lighting in their office buildings, and that's what they're doing this year for their carbon commitments, I mean, enough already. We've had a decade of being shaking fingers and saying, that is like a decimal point amount of your carbon footprint. And, sort of starting where it's easiest to start rather than where it matters the most. We have run out of time for that. Okay. The time has run out. And we really need the industry to be focusing on their tier 2s, as you just said, which is their dyeing and finishing, which is where all the tons of their carbon and their air and water pollution lie. And get serious. Yep. I mean, at a bare minimum, we've got to start focusing. If you've only got a certain number of FTEs in dollars, you should be putting it where you're going to have the biggest impact.
That's right. Well, you and I could be a little dangerous because we could be having our our venting conversation, and I think it's good. But what I want to also draw to is you did a beautiful job of bringing together the leaders. So there are companies who are really taking this on, and they're the ones that really helped found the organization that I'm running, which is now scaling the work you began, and really see and really looking. They are looking at how are we going to achieve these goals of 45% CO2 emissions reductions in our supply chain by the year 2030, which is the commitment. So and that's the work that AII is now, working to help look at how do we build in programs to eliminate coal, scale renewable energy. And it had to start with the foundational work of this clean by design efficiency work. So as I always quote you in saying it's the gateway drug to everything else you would do to improve your facilities.
It's true. And then, for people curious about clean by design, I think you're making an important point that I just want to underscore, which is we've kind of like feasted on the very kind of nerdy and granular technical aspects of this that, I guess started from like, here she is, a toxicologist working, for the fashion industry. Like, what are you thinking? But, the other side of this, which was the public facing side, was so brought to light by two people at NRDC that I just want to call out. And they were both on our board of directors. So one was Bob Fisher, who at the time was the CEO of Gap, who heard about this project because he was on the NRDC board, and I did a little presentation. And, he actually went to China with me for 10 days to explore this project, to explore his factories, and to really help me understand what this industry was all about from the public facing side. which was just a tremendous investment of time and effort on his part, with all sorts of other people stepping in from Gap and helping, with that tour. And then the other person on our board of directors was Anna Carter, who is the wife of Graydon Carter, then of Vanity Fair magazine, who had a passion for the environmental impacts of the fashion industry. Came to our board with this passion, and I just couldn't believe my luck, because it was exactly what I happened to be working on. When does that happen? And then she was the one to really help me and help the project develop its sort of public persona with various high-end fashion companies, Stella McCartney, even Anna Wintour, introductions to the CFDA, et cetera. So the secret success to Clean by Design in its infancy and in its adolescence was, I think, this combination that it actually got the technical details right, but that it also was striving to get sort of a public persona right. And again, learning from those experiences, what's going to click, what's going to work, how can we make this happen, was every bit as much on that side of the public face side as it was the technical side. Both necessary, but not alone sufficient.
I think you're absolutely right. And it speaks to, and, running organizations like the ones that I've run as well too, and the ones you've been a part of, it is this combination of different types of people, from the technical expertise to make sure that the quality of and integrity of your program and what it stands for. But then it is also luminaries that are out there, people that are running companies or people that run magazines. Like this is the way the world works. And so the stars have aligned around, bringing together a collective of people who have seen this work and believe in it. And so
for me personally, it's just tremendously helpful and rewarding that to explain the program and these topics to people who have, no technical background, they're not policy wonks, they really don't care about any of this. But the challenge of making it click in that world was really fun for me. I got a total kick out of it, and very, very enlightening and helpful. So, I really, it was my favorite component of the work overall.
Yeah, and you ended up on the pages of Vanity Fair as photographed by Annie Leibovitz. So come on.
I laughed with everybody. I should have retired right then. That was definitely a peak life experience. I don't know where you go from there. Really extremely fun.
So speaking of which, you have evolved your leadership in this space to be working with IPE in China. Tell me a little bit about how that fits with where you came from with Clean by Design and NRDC and what you're working on there.
Yeah, so I had gotten to know IPE from my China work. They're the leading environmental NGO in China, a Chinese national NGO, and they had a few small projects going on with NRDC, and that's how I got to know them. And their director, Majun, and I found ourselves on, a few panel discussions and conferences together, and we really just sort of didn't hardly knew each other, but liked each other as much as we knew. And then one fateful day in 2011, he called me in my office at NRDC and asked me if I could help him get the attention of Apple, because Apple had a large number of polluting factories in China that he had been trying unsuccessfully to bring to their attention by publishing reports and by sending them emails, et cetera. And they were just ignoring him because he came from a small Chinese environmental organization that they had never heard of. And he hoped that NRDC, with a larger US reputation, could capture the attention of Apple. So, as people who know me can imagine, and just reflecting on my badass award for 1 minute, I was like, yes, I would be happy to help you with this. And in all seriousness, I really thought that, he was right that NRDC could help to at least bring attention to the complaints that they had generated based on some very good research. So that, to make a long story short, we then worked very actively together with Apple for probably about 18 months, and Apple completely turned around, becoming, going from a non-responsive company to a leader in supply chain responsibility. And in all that work together, we got to be, tight colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to really appreciate the work that they did and the way that they did their work. So then many years go by, and a few years ago, I guess, plus years ago, my June and I were together here in Washington having lunch because he had won an award at the National Geographic. And he mentioned to me that he had an opportunity to have a senior fellow, work globally for him. And, would I ever be interested in thinking about that? He was very tentative because he didn't want to, kind of steal me away from NRDC. But I was really ready to do something new. And I was still so committed to the problems of pollution in China. I was very, very intrigued by the information disclosure strategy that they use, which let's talk about that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, I decided, now's the time to fly the coop. I had worked for NRDC for almost 30 years.
Wow.
And had done a lot of great stuff with them, but it was time to do something new. And it was a great move. I've been really happy to be able to contribute to that organization.
Wow. Well, what I loved about the first time I think I saw you present that work was when you and I were on Nantucket and we were meeting with Wendy Schmidt, and she was funding us at Cradle to Cradle, and I was looking for intersections with our work with yours, and being able to see the work of how it really was stepping up and looking at the ability to real-time track air quality and look at sources, and it was this whole sort of data-driven real-time approach towards knowing exactly where the hotspots were, which we talk about that in the work that we do, like identifying the hotspots, and then you go in and with the intervention. So it's like now we're not just looking off some spreadsheets that somebody might have entered in, we're actually looking at real data. And then the other point that I thought was so brilliant about it is that, ultimately we're talking about systems, whether they're environmental systems or manufacturing industrial park systems. So solving for just apparel in that is good, but how about if you add everybody else who's there together? So then you're going at it from a regional and or specific problem approach as opposed to kind of coming in at just one piece, right? So
Right.
and that's kind of what IP is really able to do by expanding it to electronics and other industries as well.
Exactly. And just to step back for people who don't know, China actually has very progressive monitoring requirements for 20,000 of its largest factories, which are doing real-time monitoring with probes and immediately reporting in real time that data to the authorities. And so what IPE has done is collected all the data, which is already theoretically public data, but made it very accessible and user-friendly, and created systems and tools that the general public can use and that the private sector can use to run through that data, find out where the problems are, and then respond to the data. So the thing it's really truly transformative type of work. And the reason I'm so interested in it is, we've seen the story over and over again of, less developed countries that get a bunch of factories in. They're trying to develop their economies. They make a huge mess environmentally. This is, of course, the path of China 10 years ago. And then, they've created just a huge problem to solve, and meanwhile threatened everybody's health and the integrity of their environment. And so these 21st century types of tools, that improved monitoring and reporting and the public access to that data, is just potentially very transformative, not just for China, but for any developing country in the world. So that's why I jumped right on it. I just really thought, here I am, done, so many more conventional types of projects to try to improve environmental protection in the world. This is new, exciting, and different, and really has the potential to make a huge difference, both in the textile industry and fashion industry and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, and I want to make one key point about what you just said is we're describing the way the developing countries are doing this. By the way, everyone, this is exactly what the United States did. And when we self-actualized as a nation and decided we wanted to have clean rivers and streets, and stop polluting, then we created campaigns like Keep America Beautiful, and we established the EPA, and we had Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. And then did we actually change the way things were made, or did we just push them to another part of the world and say, we expect low price points, so you should do it the way we used to do it, but now it's more expensive to do it in the US because we have higher standards. So it's this real catch-22. So I think it's important for people to hear, when they hear this, and not think about, and shame and blame these countries. It's kind of like they're just trying to build their economies the same way we had built ours.
Exactly. And as one guy in China, Chinese official once said to me, which I thought was very poignant, he said, Linda, do you really think the mayor of Pittsburgh would have voluntarily gotten rid of the steel industry? I don't think so. Notwithstanding its pollution load, because it was absolutely a cornerstone of the economy of his city in that region. And look at what happened to Pittsburgh. Those facilities chose to leave because they could do so. And now they're in my country, in China. So for you to expect me to close them down, is unrealistic. Right. So let's come up with a better solution than that, which of course is just control the pollution well, rather than shutting it down. But I think that's a very important point, that we did get on top of our pollution problems in this country with very important laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And they never have looked more valuable than today when we look at the pollution problems that are elsewhere. But let's also be a little humble about exactly how we wound up with these pristine environmental conditions in some places in our country, because we outsourced our pollution to these other places, and now they have their hands full taking care of it.
Right. And so on a final note on that, I'll say to the consumer, to the citizen, to all of us, when you buy something, know where and how it was made. And that's what we're all trying to do, is create more transparency for people to have the information to understand, because you might be funding the bad systems, right? So it's like we kind of all are culpable, basically. And that's what we're trying to do now, is when you know better, you do better. And so with that, I know we're getting towards the end of our time. And I love it because, like I say with everybody, this is a great conversation that could go so long. But I want to ask sort of two sort of personal questions. The first one is related to this work or anything. What keeps you up at night in terms of the state of the world, this work, etc.?
So let me just say something, that for 30 years of my career, I was not a carbon girl. I'm a toxicologist. I was all about industrial pollution. But what keeps me up at night is climate change. And what keeps me up, the specific thing about it is, I am just really concerned that these companies, we're resting a lot on the commitments of the private sector. We've got so many initiatives circling around that. And that many leading companies have stepped up to make commitments, but they have no idea what this is going to take. And when they really look at it from a professional perspective, they're not going to be able to find their carbon. Not even close, Louis, not even close. Yeah. So what keeps me up at night is, when are we going to face reality here? And then what are we going to do about it? Because the sort of the solutions that are bantered about, they're not going to be enough. They're not even going to be half enough. And we know we're in an urgent emergency. So that's what keeps me up, is this sort of ships passing in the night, where at the moment still it's enough to talk a big game. But then the lack of, let's call it professional level, undergirding of those commitments, so that we can be assured that they will be achieved. To the contrary, I think when people get serious, there's going to be a giant freak out moment. And I just don't want that to be, in 2029, 1 month before they're supposed to have delivered their results.
Yeah. Well, we're already, and you and I've had a conversation last week about this. We already kind of have identified this problem, and I think that it's going to be up to all of us to elevate this in a way that we can also say, it's not that we can't do it, it's that under the current way we're looking at it, or maybe haven't even looked at it, are we really looking at the thing right in front of us carefully enough? And we can do it, but it is going to require a total rehaul of the way we think of our relationship to products, and how much we make as a global society, and how much we need, how much we share, repair, swap, circulate. I mean, all these things are going to have to be critical too, because the elephant in the room, and it's not so much the elephant in the room, it is the room, is that the current model of how much we make and how much we need that as a global society to feed our economic systems and our markets is not going to continue to work. Is that,
right?
Do you agree?
As they say, what has gotten us this far is not going to get us where we want to be.
Right.
Amen.
Right.
But then that really shakes things up, and we're not shook up yet. We're still pretending, and we've just got to really kind of get over that threshold so we can start addressing these larger problems.
It's kind of like sobriety. It's like, once you reach your bottom and you admit it and you're willing to get help, then you go into a whole new world. And I think that's what, me, I'm the optimist, and I'm the corporate friend, and you are too. And I think it's like, I don't see this as, damnation. I see this as, wow, this is going to get exciting because we get to completely reimagine the way we build wealth. We build, livelihood for workers around the world. We can do this. It's just going to have to be a reimagining and a rebuilding.
I agree. I feel very optimistic about that, actually, and hopeful. And I'm not just saying that to have people feel good. And we haven't really tried that hard yet. So there's a lot, there's a lot possible.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I was at a dinner at Levi's a couple of years ago, and their CEO then, Chip Bergh, was saying, when we are under constraints, and this is true in the design world, this is true in a lot, when we have limitations placed on it, it's actually when we have the most creativity, and that's when I get the most excited. And I thought, I love that somebody who thinks that way is leading Levi's, and I think that we all need to think that way more. This is actually a time for invention and creativity. And anyway, we could go on. Last question is leadership. We've been talking about that a lot. That's sort of the thread through all this. What does leadership mean to you? What does it look like to you?
So, to me, leadership is the opposite of caretaking. You don't take a job in order to manage the status quo and be a real leader. You don't want to just keep everything the same and just manage to get day by day. And I think that a strong leader really needs to have a vision of where things need to go. And they need to have the right balance of optimum risk taking. Okay. So they've got to be willing to take some risks, and they've got to be willing to fail once in a while. And yet they can't be reckless. So a leader is one that's willing to kind of has that uncanny ability to know, here's where I want to go, the vision thing, and then kind of here's what I'm willing, the risk I'm willing to take in order to get there, and to have that be the right calculation so that he doesn't crash the company or the organization, but on the other hand, he doesn't just play it safe. And I think a lot of successful leaders just kind of maintain the bottom line or even grow the bottom line, but they're really playing it safe. That's not the kind of leadership that we need on our issues, because as we were just talking about, we know we've got to really shake it up.
Yep. You're reminding me of something that when I was at Mohawk Industries, my CEO said to me, which was, when you're a visionary, Lewis, when you're a visionary, if you roll out the whole plan to everybody right away, they'll freak out and they'll fire you. So you have to dole it out 5% at a time. So the thing is, we don't have 5% of the time anymore. And what we need to do is, and it's back to what we were saying about supporting the manufacturers and a risk-taking culture. We need to create a culture where the CEO won't get fired, where we look at longer-term market returns and not quarterly as the more valuable. And so I think that we have to shift the way we think about going into this and protect ourselves around not chopping off the head of the king who we're not pleased with on a certain day to support the process, right?
Right. Or in the words of a downhill ski instructor of mine, when I was probably about 12, if you're not falling, you're not trying.
Yeah.
I was a very cautious skier. And so I think that is kind of the attitude we have to have, that failure is not only necessary, but actually a good thing, because you're pushing it so that you will be able to get better. And we just need to inculcate that into the culture of a lot of these companies.
Yeah. It's, as I said, as I look out the window at Silicon Valley across from me, fail fast, and then get right back in there.
Exactly.
Take the learning to get, and actually that's what you want, is that you want people who are willing to fail and fail fast so that they can get better and better. With that, Linda, thank you for spending this wonderful session with me and a curious conversation about the apparel sector and about your toxicology to fashion star and truth teller. Yeah.
Well, thanks. It was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. I will look forward to seeing you soon, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. Bye, Linda.